It was an ordinary afternoon at one of the most luxurious stores in the city. The high-end fashion boutique, located in the heart of an upscale neighborhood, was known for its expensive items and exclusive clientele. The polished marble floors, gleaming glass shelves, and soft lighting created an atmosphere of elegance and sophistication, and shoppers glided through the aisles, admiring the latest trends, while staff members moved about, assisting customers and maintaining the pristine environment. Among the few customers inside that day was a well-dressed black man who walked into the store with the intention to browse and perhaps treat himself to something special. His tailored suit and polished shoes spoke of success, but as he stepped inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Near the entrance stood an older security guard, stationed to keep an eye on things. He was tall, with a broad frame and a stern face. His job was to ensure that only those who belonged in the store remained, and as he observed the man, a flicker of suspicion crossed his eyes. There was something about the man that didn't quite fit his idea of who belonged in this space. The guard's eyes followed him as he moved deeper into the store. The man, however, remained calm and confident. He had come here for a reason, not to prove anything to anyone, but to enjoy the experience of shopping in a place he had earned the right to be in. But little did he know, that simple act of entering the store would soon lead to a confrontation that would change everything. The security guard's eyes never left the man as he moved through the store, glancing at the racks of designer clothes and polished shoes. The man picked up a jacket, inspecting the fabric, then put it down and walked over to the accessories section. He casually scanned the displays of leather bags, watches, and sunglasses. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a shopper browsing through expensive merchandise. But the guard couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His eyes narrowed as he watched the man, his mind working overtime. Was he really here to buy something? Or was he just wasting time, trying to take advantage of the high-end environment without any intention of making a purchase? The man didn't appear like he belonged here. His casual demeanor, his calm composure, and his relaxed attitude all seemed out of place in a store like this. It wasn't the man's clothes that raised suspicion. He was dressed well, after all. But the guard's experience told him something else. His instinct, though, seemed clouded by a prejudice he didn't even recognize in himself. He watched the man closely, a tinge of skepticism building in his mind. As the minutes passed, the guard grew increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. The store was mostly empty, with only a couple of other shoppers lingering in the background. The man was still browsing, but the guard couldn't help but follow him, his gaze drifting from aisle to aisle as the man moved deeper into the store. It wasn't long before the man sensed he was being watched. He turned briefly, catching the security guard's eyes from across the room. The guard quickly looked away, but the moment had already passed. The man felt the weight of the scrutiny bearing down on him. His chest tightened and a wave of discomfort washed over him. He was used to being judged, used to the looks, the whispers, the suspicion, but it still stung every time. He tried to shake it off, focusing back on the clothes, but the guard wasn't done. Minutes later, he began to approach the man. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, and his eyes never strayed from the man's back. It felt like a countdown was ticking in the air. The moment was inevitable. When the guard finally spoke, his voice was firm, almost condescending. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his tone dripping with the kind of suspicion that made the man's stomach twist. The man paused for a moment, slightly taken aback by the directness of the question. He hadn't expected it to come so suddenly. "I'm just looking around," he replied, keeping his voice steady. The guard, however, wasn't satisfied. "Looking around, huh?" His eyes flicked over the man's attire once again, as if trying to decide if he was worthy of being there. "You planning on buying something, or are you just wasting time?" The words cut deeper than the man expected. The assumption that he didn't belong here, that he wasn't a customer like anyone else in the store, it stung. He felt a rush of anger simmer beneath the surface, but he held it in. There was no point in escalating things. He'd been in this position before, in countless stores, facing the subtle judgment of people who couldn't see past his skin color. "I'm just browsing," the man replied, his voice calm but laced with the weight of his frustration. He looked the guard square in the eye, hoping the message would get across, but the guard wasn't done yet. He took a step closer, his arms folding over his chest. "You sure about that? You don't look like someone who'd be interested in any of this stuff." The man could feel the insult hanging in the air, like a thick fog. He wasn't about to let this go. His blood was starting to boil, but he forced himself to stay composed. I'm sure, he said, his jaw tightening. The guard shook his head, his skepticism turning into something sharper. You know, if you're just here to waste time, I can have you removed. He made no effort to hide his disdain. We don't have time for people who aren't serious. The man stood still, his heart pounding now. He couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't just an awkward interaction, it was a direct insult, one that questioned his right to be there. He felt the weight of every stereotype, every prejudice that had been aimed at him in his life, and for a moment he wondered if he should just leave. Maybe the shopping experience wasn't worth it. But before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. Just as the tension reached its peak, a voice rang out from behind the guard, calm but authoritative. Is there a problem here? The man turned, relieved to hear the interruption. Standing just a few feet away was a woman in a sharp professional outfit. She was tall, her demeanor composed but firm. It was clear she wasn't someone who was easily intimidated. The store manager, the man realized, instantly recognizing the authority in her voice. The security guard, visibly flustered by the new presence, straightened his posture and shifted his gaze from the man to the manager. I was just asking him if he was planning on buying anything, he stammered. His eyes flicked nervously between the two, clearly caught off guard. You know, just making sure everything's in order. The manager raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical of the guard's explanation. Her gaze shifted to the man, who stood there, still composed but clearly affected by the encounter. She could tell something wasn't right. She had worked in retail long enough to know when things were off. What's going on here? She asked, directing the question to the man now, her voice gentler but firm. The man, who had tried so hard to hold his composure, felt the weight of the situation come crashing down. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, before speaking. I've been here for a while, just looking at some of your merchandise. I haven't said anything, but this security guard has been following me around the store, asking if I'm going to buy something, and implying that I'm just wasting his time. The manager's eyes flicked from the man to the guard, a deep frown appearing on her face. Is this true? She asked the guard, her tone sharp now. The guard shuffled uncomfortably, his face turning a few shades paler. Yes, but I was just what? The manager cut him off, her voice growing colder. She had worked hard to create an environment where everyone felt welcome, where customers could shop without feeling judged. And this was a direct violation of that trust. She looked back at the man, her expression softening. I'm so sorry you had to experience this, she said, her voice sincere. You shouldn't have been treated this way. She then turned her attention back to the guard, who was now shifting uncomfortably on his feet. The guard's mouth went dry, and his eyes darted to the ground as if he were trying to find a way to disappear. The situation was spiraling, and he knew there was no way to explain away his actions. The man's words had stung, but the look of disappointment in the manager's eyes cut even deeper. That's not the way we treat our customers here, the manager continued, her voice now laced with authority. She stepped closer to the man, standing between him and the guard, as if to shield him from further judgment. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. The man stood still, not fully knowing how to respond. He had expected this sort of treatment from people outside the store, not from someone working in a place he had respected. He had tried to shake it off, but there was something about being judged so openly that made the whole situation feel degrading. But then the manager turned to the guard, her next words hitting like a hammer. I want you to apologize, now. The security guard's face went crimson, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have judged you like that. It was wrong, and I regret it. I'm sorry for making you feel uncomfortable. His words were rushed, as if he was trying to get them out before he was asked to leave. He stood awkwardly, hands at his sides, knowing full well that his mistake had already been made. The man stood there, his emotions a mixture of anger, disbelief, and exhaustion. He had faced prejudice his entire life, but something about this situation felt different. Maybe it was the location. This wasn't just some random store. This was a place that prided itself on its exclusivity, its luxury, its high-end clientele. And yet, here he was, being treated like an outsider, as if he didn't belong. He looked at the security guard, whose regret was now plain to see, and for a moment, the man was tempted to escalate things further. He could demand the guard's job, make a bigger scene, but something in him told him that this would only add to the tension. He wasn't here to make a spectacle. Instead, he simply nodded, his voice cool and controlled. Apology accepted, he said, before turning his attention to the manager, who was now giving the guard a stern look. But then, as if to add to the unexpected turn of events, the manager said something that completely shifted the dynamic of the conversation. By the way, she said, glancing at the man, you should know that the person you just insulted is actually the owner of this store. The words hung in the air for a moment, both the guard and the man struck by the weight of the revelation. The security guard blinked, his mouth opening and closing, as if he were trying to find the words to express his shock. He looked at the man, now realizing his terrible mistake, his face a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. The manager didn't need to say more. The truth was undeniable. The man who had been quietly browsing through the racks had the power to make or break careers with a single word. And the guard, in all his assumptions, had just humiliated the very person who owned it all. The guard stood frozen, his face now pale as his stomach twisted in knots. The weight of his mistake hit him harder than any physical blow. He had just insulted the very person who not only owned the store, but was responsible for its success. His mouth felt dry, and his legs felt shaky, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly become unsteady. I didn't know, the guard stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He glanced nervously at the manager, who was still standing between him and the man, her face unreadable. She was waiting for the next move, waiting to see how the guard would handle the situation he had so carelessly created. The man, still standing with his arms crossed, studied the guard with a steady gaze. He felt the anger inside him begin to subside, replaced by an icy calm. His disappointment, though, was as sharp as ever. He wasn't sure what he had expected from the guard. A quick apology, an explanation, maybe, but what he got was just the stammering of someone who had been caught in the act of their own ignorance. The guard, realizing he was trapped in his own shame, shifted uneasily. He cleared his throat before speaking again. I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have assumed anything about you. It was wrong of me. I apologize for making you feel uncomfortable. I didn't mean to insult you. The apology was rushed, filled with panic, but it lacked the sincerity the man needed to hear. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak immediately. He could tell that the guard was genuinely regretful, but the sting of the words still lingered. The hurt wasn't easily erased. Sorry isn't enough, the man said quietly, his voice calm but firm. You don't just insult someone and expect a simple sorry to make it all go away. He let the words settle in the air, his gaze never leaving the guard's face. You need to think about what you just did. You assumed something about me just because of the way I look. You didn't see me as a person, you saw me as a stereotype. The guard lowered his head, the weight of the accusation hitting him harder than anything else. He hadn't considered it like that. In his mind, he was just doing his job, trying to keep the store safe, to make sure everything ran smoothly. But now, seeing the man in front of him, hearing his words, the guard realized how deeply his own biases had shaped his actions. I understand, the guard said quietly, his voice thick with regret. I was wrong, I didn't give you the respect you deserved, and I won't make that mistake again. The man nodded slowly, not because he fully accepted the apology, but because he could see the guard was at least trying to understand his mistake. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He couldn't change the past, but maybe he could find a way to move forward. The store manager, who had been watching the exchange closely, stepped forward, her expression still stern but softer now. This is a learning moment for everyone, including you, she said, addressing the guard. You have to treat every customer with respect, no matter who they are or how they look. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior in this store. The guard nodded quickly, almost desperate. I understand, it won't happen again. The manager turned her attention to the man, her expression shifting to one of genuine empathy. I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. It's unacceptable. Her voice was warm now, and the sincerity in her words made the man feel a little better. Please know that this isn't how we do things here. You're always welcome in this store. The man gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, his features softening just a bit. He appreciated her intervention, her effort to make things right. But the moment wasn't over yet. The guard was still standing there, waiting for something, and the man knew there was one last thing he needed to say. Look, the man said, his voice steady but his eyes still sharp. I'm not here to make a scene. I'm not going to cause trouble for you. But this has to be a lesson for both of us. You can't judge people based on their appearance. You don't know what they're capable of, what they've worked for, or where they've been. The guard's face reddened slightly, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and understanding. You're right. I've learned my lesson. I promise I won't do it again. The man studied him for a moment longer before nodding. I hope not. There was a moment of silence before the manager spoke again, her voice gentle. As a gesture of goodwill, she said to the man, I'd like to offer you a discount on any item in the store. It's the least we can do after this unfortunate incident. The man glanced at the manager, a small smile flickering across his face. He appreciated the gesture, but he wasn't here for a discount or any kind of reward. It wasn't about money, it was about respect. But he couldn't turn down the offer. Thank you, he said quietly, his tone softening. I'll take you up on that. With that, the man walked toward the counter, where the manager rang up his purchase, a sleek, expensive jacket that he'd had his eye on earlier. The guard watched him go, the shame still lingering on his face. He had made a mistake, a big one, and it wasn't just a small misunderstanding. It was a realization that his assumptions had been rooted in deep-seated prejudice. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it was one he would never forget. The man left the store with a sense of quiet resolution. He had stood his ground, shown the guard a lesson in respect, and walked away with his dignity intact. The encounter hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. He couldn't control how others treated him, but he could choose how he responded, and today, he had chosen to handle it with grace. As the man stepped out into the bright sunlight, the door of the store closing behind him, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world was changing, one small lesson at a time. The days following the incident in the store were surprisingly quiet, yet the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. The man hadn't expected a dramatic resolution, but the events had stirred something inside him, a quiet hope that things could be different, that perhaps, just perhaps, people could learn from their mistakes. Meanwhile, inside the luxury store, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. The guard, still embarrassed by his behavior, had taken to heart the conversation with the man and the manager. Every time a customer walked through the door, the guard found himself thinking twice before making any assumptions. His vigilance was now tempered with a new level of awareness. He started to engage with each customer, not out of suspicion, but with respect, offering help when it was needed, never assuming anything based on appearance alone. His demeanor had softened, his once rigid stance now more approachable. For the store manager, the incident was a turning point as well. She had always prided herself on maintaining a welcoming environment, but witnessing firsthand the damage caused by bias had made her rethink her approach to training staff. She immediately organized a meeting with her employees, including the security guard, to discuss customer relations and diversity awareness. It was a delicate conversation, but one that needed to happen. The lesson wasn't just for the guard, it was for everyone. She wanted to ensure that no one would ever feel the way that man had felt again, not in her store, not on her watch. And though the man had left the store with a sense of quiet resolution, he couldn't fully shake the feeling that his actions had sparked a ripple, that his small stand had made a difference. He hadn't gone out of his way to change anyone's life. He hadn't intended to make a statement, but somehow, in that moment, in that space, he had reminded someone of their humanity, and that reminder had rippled outward. As the weeks passed, he returned to the store several times. Each time the experience was different. The staff greeted him warmly, the security guard offered a respectful nod, and the manager took the time to thank him again for teaching them all such an important lesson. There was a noticeable change in how people interacted with him. No longer was he just another face in the crowd. One day, as the man was checking out a new jacket, the manager came over, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, her voice kind but serious. He paused, surprised, and then nodded. Of course. The manager led him to a quiet corner of the store, out of earshot from other customers. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her voice steady. "I just wanted to thank you, once again, for the way you handled everything that day. You've made a lasting impact here. The entire team is more aware now. We've been working on improving our customer service training, and I wanted you to know that your actions have played a big part in that. The man was taken aback. He hadn't expected anything like this. I didn't do anything special, he said modestly. I just didn't let it slide. I stood up for myself. But you did more than that, the manager insisted. You made us all think, really think about how we treat people, and that's not something that happens every day. So thank you. The man smiled, the warmth from her words washing over him. I'm just glad it helped. Before he left, the manager handed him a small card, a VIP loyalty card, that would give him access to exclusive sales, personal shopping assistance, and other perks at the store. It was a gesture, a recognition of the positive change he had helped bring about. But it wasn't the card that mattered most. It was the acknowledgement that his experience had made a difference, not just in the store, but in the way the staff treated everyone who walked through those doors. The security guard, too, gave the man a respectful nod as he left, his face now one of genuine appreciation. It was clear that the lesson had stuck. The man couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had turned a negative situation into something that had changed the course of a few lives, including his own. Later that evening, as the man sat at home reflecting on the events of the past few weeks, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson, but in standing up for himself, he had shown others the importance of respect and the value of every human being, regardless of their background or appearance. It wasn't a victory won with loud words or grand gestures. It was a subtle, quiet triumph, a reminder that change often begins with a single moment of integrity, when someone refuses to let prejudice go unchecked. And as he looked at the jacket he had purchased that day, he knew that it wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol, a reminder that sometimes, doing the right thing, no matter how small, can create ripples that reach further than we ever imagine. The man smiled to himself. In a world that often seemed so divided, it was moments like these that proved it didn't take much to start making a difference. One conversation, one action, one decision to stand up for what's right, it all added up. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change the world, one small step at a time. The story didn't end there though. The incident in the luxury store had already started a chain reaction, and its effects were felt far beyond that particular day, or that particular store. The man who had experienced the insult had no idea at the time that his simple decision to stand up for himself would carry such weight, would stir something inside others, and would ripple outward in ways he couldn't have imagined. The next day, as he went about his usual routine, he couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just an isolated event. His experience had opened a door through which conversations had begun, and perspectives had shifted. It was a subtle change, but it was there, quietly present in the people he interacted with, the subtle ways they treated him differently. At work, for example, he noticed something. His coworkers, who had always greeted him with a polite but distant smile, now interacted with him more openly, more comfortably. There was no longer that underlying sense of judgment that sometimes lingered in the air, the quiet assumptions about his background or the way he looked. They didn't ask invasive questions or assume things about him. Instead, they just treated him as he was, a person, nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a shift. He could feel it, and it made him realize that sometimes the change wasn't immediate. It didn't happen in the blink of an eye, but it was happening, little by little, in the way people saw him, and in the way they saw each other. The security guard, for his part, was no longer the same man. He had been doing a lot of self-reflection, and his behavior at work had undergone a significant transformation. Whenever he encountered customers now, he made a point to engage them with warmth, not suspicion. He didn't follow them around the store, or watch them with distrust. Instead, he asked if they needed help with anything, offered assistance in a polite and respectful way, and most importantly, he gave them the dignity they deserved as human beings. He wasn't perfect. He still had his moments of hesitation, moments where he had to catch himself from slipping back into old habits, but he was trying, and that was what mattered. It was a start, and that was enough.
The store manager also played her part in ensuring the changes took root. She worked closely with her team to make sure that no one in the store would ever make the same mistake again. They had started offering diversity training sessions, inviting guest speakers to discuss inclusivity and bias in retail. It wasn't just about making the store a better place for customers, it was about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of their background, felt respected and valued. The manager made sure that these lessons weren't just words on a page, but lived experiences for her team, reminding them regularly of the importance of empathy and understanding. And as the weeks went by, the man continued to visit the store. Each time he walked through the doors, he saw the shift. The staff were more open, more aware of their customers' individuality, their unique stories, and the weight of their personal experiences. There was a new atmosphere in the air, one that felt welcoming and inclusive. One day, the man returned to the store to purchase a few things for his home. As he approached the checkout, the security guard gave him a warm nod, a silent acknowledgement that their encounter had been transformative for both of them. The man smiled and nodded back, no longer feeling the sting of the past, but rather the quiet peace of having been part of something bigger than himself. At that moment, the man realized something profound. He hadn't just stood up for himself in a store that day. He had done something even more important. He had started a conversation that needed to be had, a conversation about prejudice, about assumptions, and about the importance of seeing each other for who we truly are. It was a quiet revolution. It didn't make headlines or go viral on social media, but it didn't need to. The change had started small, but it was real, and it was lasting. And what made it even more powerful was that the man hadn't intended to start a movement. He hadn't planned on being a catalyst for change. He had simply refused to let someone treat him with disrespect, and in doing so, he had unknowingly sparked a ripple effect. In the days that followed, the store became known not only for its luxury items, but for the way it treated its customers. People talked about it, not because of the high-end goods they sold, but because of the way they made people feel when they walked through the doors. The story of the man who stood up for himself had spread beyond the walls of that store, becoming a lesson for others about the power of dignity and respect. And it wasn't just in that store. The man's experience had begun to inspire others in his community. Friends and family members who had witnessed what happened started having their own conversations about how they treated others. They began to question their own biases and examine their assumptions. It was like a ripple in a pond, small at first, but soon touching everything around it, spreading out into places the man hadn't even imagined. In a world that often seemed divided, where differences were amplified and misunderstandings seemed inevitable, moments like these proved that change didn't always have to come from something large or dramatic. Sometimes, it could begin with one person standing up, quietly and resolutely, for the respect and dignity they deserved. And sometimes, that simple act could create a ripple that touched far more lives than anyone could have ever expected. As the man walked out of the store that day, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment, he realized that his life had been changed by that one moment of confrontation. And though it had started with a single story, it had evolved into something much larger, a movement toward kindness, understanding, and empathy that would continue to grow, one small act at a time.